Some common phrases you'll hear when the topic of both manga and comic books come up is usually something along the lines of manga has taken over comics are irrelevant, the comic book industry is dying, etc., etc. Now, it is a fact that manga does outsell comics. It's been outselling for a while. I mean, go to your local Books A Million or Barnes& and Noble and see the size difference between the manga shelf and the comic shelf. At my Books A Million, it's two wide full shelves of manga filled, with extra tables just stacked full of them. But there's basically three skinny shelves for Marvel, DC, and Image Comics. Now, of course, this isn't a definitive measurement, but still. In May of 2021, Demon Slayer outsold the entire comic book industry in that year, selling 100 million copies, while comics altogether sold around 15 million. This, of course, counts manga sold in America as well. Why is that? Why is it that mangas have been outselling comics? I think it has several reasons why. Comic books and mangas are illustrations in segmented panels telling a story with authors and illustrators, telling all types of stories from slice of life to the superhero genre. There are some big differences, however. Mangas are usually just one story, with normally just a writer and artist. Sometimes the writer is also the artist or even a team to make it. Comic books are usually branched out, interconnected with each other. They can oftentimes switch between writers and artists out of the blue. Not to mention, they usually affect the main continuity of the universe. One of the main differences is that mangas have an end, where usually comic books don't. Most of the time, it's a miniseries that will have an actual end to it. In Elseworld or alternate universe normally. In mainstream comics, the only real things that end is just a big event that the characters then transfer to another. There are of course exceptions in comics, like Invincible having an actual ending in its story. I believe marketing and recognizability is also a big factor in manga outselling comics. Marvel and DC are household names. Everybody knows about Marvel and DC. Everybody knows Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, Hulk. And these characters are so famous to the point where they ironically can become irrelevant to people. Sometimes people just straight up won't care about what happens to a popular character in a specific comic. But not everybody knows about Demon Slayer or Berserk or One Punch Man or Vagabond, even if they are insanely popular. Oftentimes that will make the average person more interested in the manga. I remember hearing about Chainsaw Man for the first time, seeing some dude fight demons with a chainsaw coming out of his face and arms. It was crazy, and so I was vastly interested in it. I already knew about Spider-Man, and even though I've always loved him, I wasn't too interested in his comics at the time because I was already so familiar with him, but I wasn't familiar with Chainsaw Man. The adaptations that mangas get are animes, and these animes can look amazing with spectacular animation, sound design, and music. Whereas with comics, the main adaptations are of course TV shows, movies, and video games. Animes, most of the time, follow along the manga, whereas the comic adaptations can oftentimes be written differently than the main source material, most often just loosely based off the original comic. Because mangas are usually self-contained, you will ironically see a more open world, a more open genre with more types of stories than comic books, with specific power systems, world building, and storylines that will need to be weaved and interconnected in a regular comic book if it's Marvel or DC. Mangas genuinely have a lot of material, with vastly different worlds with each manga. Historical fiction, fantasy, supernatural, sci-fi, supernatural, and sci-fi, whereas with comics, if you limit yourself to Marvel and DC, you'll get similar stories with the same heroes and villains, however used in different ways. There is of course things like alternate universes and Elseworlds. Like DC's Dark Knights of Steel, basically if the DC universe was in a fantasy setting in medieval Europe. Or Marvel's What If series, a series about answering the question like what if this specific thing happened in a character's story, like what if Spider-Man kept the Venom symbiote. Examples of manga is stories like Berserk, a fantasy manga most likely taking place in medieval Europe, with elves, dwarves, ogres, dragons, etc. A story about overcoming great obstacles, trauma, vengeance, violence, and the mindset of keep moving forward. Kaiju number 8 is about a guy surviving in a world full of giant kaiju who gains the ability of becoming one. Origin is about an android trying to find out basically the meaning of life. Dr. Stone is about a genius kid and his friend trying to save the world after every single human has been turned into stone. Now I completely understand that there are many comics similar to this. It's not all just complicated big events that you gotta read a dozen issues to understand, but manga is basically just self-contained stories where, like I said, comics are an expanded universe. There are of course amazing self-contained comic runs that you should definitely check out, like Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, a story about vengeance and trauma, Batman Superman World's Finest, about Batman and Superman going on some crazy adventures, the Ultimate Spider-Man series, The Watchmen, Immortal Hulk, etc. There is of course the wokeness that people love to chant. I already made a video on how wokeness isn't the main reason comic sales have been going down, that apparently comic books are just full of forced diversity and politics. Even though both comics and manga have had diversity and politics for decades. Diversity and politics is incredibly prevalent in anime and manga. Most of the stories take place in Japan, Japan being a predominantly Asian country, and most of the characters in the manga will usually be Asian. Even stories that don't take place in Japan still have a lot of diversity in it. And politics have always influenced it, to the point where they are the main factors in a story. Full Metal Alchemist, One Piece, Vinland Saga. Those same things that people complain about in comics is also incredibly prevalent in manga, so that doesn't add up. If anything, diversity and politics helped create both comic books and manga. Comic books and manga wouldn't be what it is today without diversity and politics, but I digress. Comics really aren't beginner friendly, ironically. A lot of times getting into comics is mainly just, you gotta read this to understand this, with several stories that branch out that you can also read. You know when you're reading a comic book, and there's an editor's note saying, check out this event, issue 32, to figure out why this character is wearing a different outfit and looks like that. Comic book stories are essentially the branches of a tree, with the main continuity being the trunk. I wanted to get into the X-Men, but I had no clue where to start, and you won't get a consistent answer. Read this story by Chris Claremont, read this story by John Hickman. The Krakoa event is a big event for the mutants, giving them refuge away from all the discrimination that they face. Marvel themselves said that if you want to get into the X-Men, start at the Krakoa era, House of X, Power of 10. What about the decades and decades of X-Men lore before that? What about the Xavier Mansion? Why is Charles Xavier able to walk? What do I have to read before that? With DC, it's a bit easier. I mean, you can just start at the reboots. You can start at the beginning of the New 52 and look up a guide on what to read. The most recent reboot, named Rebirth, is also more simple. You can also look up a couple guides too. Dawn of DC is another event, not exactly a reboot, and it started beginning of this year, so you can read that too. DC even has a list of things to read. The many writers and illustrators can also harm comics as well. Like I said, manga is usually just a writer and artist, or a team to make a manga. With comics, sometimes a new writer will just step in. Sometimes you might get a writer who will drop a banger like Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, and other times a writer like Michael Bendis will affect something rather drastically, like how he aged up Jonathan Kent, Superman's son, and how now we don't get to have more stories of him raising a child just like him, with the same good moral compass that his parents raised him with, while also understanding exactly what his son will be going through, and will be able to guide his son properly. Because of the fact that comics don't end, writers will come up with basically anything to keep the stories coming, even things that will be detrimental to that character, like the current run of Amazing Spider-Man written by Zeb Wells, infamously horrible, and is not even done releasing. This is another example of just needing to keep making more stories for a comic, and so a writer will come in and just nuke the place. I honestly might make a video just talking about why this run is so horrible, because it's just absolutely crazy how bad it is. Shit like this also deters off readers, both new and old. Fans are tired of seeing Spider-Man just be down on his luck, not being able to catch a fucking break. And new readers will just get misinterpreted of Spider-Man, thinking that he's a pathetic character when he's far from it. People are more likely to hover over the manga than comics. Mangas have an end where comics usually don't. Mangas have a self-contained story where comics usually don't. It's rare for a manga to have another writer step in and just mess something up. I love comic books with all my heart, and this video is not about manga being better than comics. But I have to recognize that there are factors that play into why manga has been outselling comics like crazy, why a lot of comic readers are just dropping them in general. Incompetent writers, complicated storylines, washed out characters, character assassinations, ironically not being beginner friendly, etc, etc. There is of course mangas having runs for decades. Sure, series like Hajime no Ippo and One Piece have been going on for a very long time, but at least they are consistent, self-contained stories where comics are not as much. Comics have been making a rise again. The Spider-Verse movie and its upcoming sequel have done wonders for Marvel and made so many more people aware of Miles Morales and other characters. Directors like James Gunn will do wonders for DC with his upcoming Flashpoint movie, along with Superman Legacy and Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow. Amazon Prime's Invincible has really boosted up Invincible's popularity, I believe, and because it's a self-contained story, new readers have been pulling up in it like crazy. Along with season 2 coming soon, and having well-known and well-loved actors as the voice actors for some of the characters. I never thought I'd be hearing Seth Rogen play Alan the Alien, but I love it. Comic books are of course immensely popular, but the mass public has probably watched more movies of the superheroes than actually reading their specific books. I don't really know how comics can try to match manga once again or even become more relevant. A thing I do know is that they sure as shit can't keep allowing stories like The Amazing Spider-Man to be greenlit, and I do know for a fact that the industry is not dying, but they can definitely do something about the sales going down. And no, comics can't just end like people said they should. You can't just have Superman or Spider-Man or Marvel and DC just end. That's not how they're published. Image Comics may be published that way, but not Marvel or DC. And this supposed wokeness isn't a factor either. I think it's just mainly the mass public already being familiar with comic book characters and not wanting to go through reading multiple connected stories to understand something, whereas with manga, you can find new characters and finish a story in one sitting or multiple sittings if you want to. You want to get into the X-Men, where the hell do you start? You want to start reading One Punch Man? Start at One Punch Man Chapter 1. It can honestly get frustrating trying to read a story and not knowing where to start, because then it'll negatively influence your perspective on reading the story. Now, like I said, this video isn't about manga being better than comics. Honestly, I don't even think you can actually compare comics and manga that way. That could be another video in itself. This video is about why manga sells better than comics. I love comic books with all my heart, but it'd be ignorant of me to not recognize the factors that resulted in this. Does manga outselling comics mean that comics are bad and manga is better? No. Should you still read comic books? Of course, if you want to. I do hope eventually that comics will make a more consistent rise again, but I don't know exactly how that will take place. A very clever thing is what the upcoming Blue Beetle movie did. In its first trailer, which garnered millions of views, they suggested multiple comics to read to get a taste of the character of Blue Beetle. That was a clever thing to do. I think that comics should have a better way of marketing not just the movies, but the comics as well. The same way that they market the movies, it'd be very beneficial if they marketed comics that way as well, like what Blue Beetle did. I do hope that people will be more open to comics instead of just looking at bad examples like Zeb Wells' Amazing Spider-Man and think just all comics are like that. I might make a video next talking about Zeb Wells' Spider-Man, but I'd have to complete it first, or another video talking about if you can really compare manga and comic books, or a video essay on something else. I don't know. I guess this video is a video essay or something. That's mainly what I'm trying to do, but I got like almost no ideas. I'm trying to come up with them, so bear with me. Thanks for watching. Tell me what you think in the comments. I got links to my socials in the description. Be kind to yourselves and each other. Thanks for watching.